Hello and welcome to my presentation on creating and consuming RESTful web services in Apex. I gave this presentation earlier this year at the OUG Midlands Tech event and also at Tech 18 last December, and I've been asked if I would put a copy up online, so here it is. My name's Colin Archer, I'm a development consultant. I have over 20 years experience in Oracle technologies, and as well as being a consultant and a developer, I also do training, speaking and blogging. I work for Explorer in the development team. We're an Oracle Platinum partner with multiple specializations to our name, such as managed services, engineered systems, and Oracle Cloud implementations. We're the #1 development consultancy in the UK with a particular focus on Forms to Apex projects. We're also the current Oracle System Partner of the Year award winner, and we've won the UK OUG Database Partner of the Year award for the last 4 years running. Before we start looking at web services in Apex, I'd briefly like to talk about creating web services in the database using the APIs and how that compares with Apex. I'd also like to look at the structure of Oracle Web Services and how you can access them. There are two main options available to Apex developers for the creation of web services: the database APIs or the Apex interface. Web services creating using the database APIs are stored in the ORDS metadata schema. However, in Apex up to version 5, they were stored in the Apex schema, meaning web services created using the database APIs could not be maintained or viewed using Apex, or vice versa. However, that all changed from version 18.1 of Apex. Web services now created in Apex are also stored in the ORDS metadata schema, which means you can create and maintain them using either option. Web services in Oracle are made up of 5 levels: schemas, modules, templates, handlers, and parameters. The top level is for the database schema. Each schema you want to use must be enabled for ORDS, and it's good practice to use an alias different from your actual schema name to reduce security threats. The second level is the modules and is a logical grouping of resources. For example, you might have one module for HR and another for accounts. It's good practice to include a version number in your module definitions, as this will allow you to release updated versions while still keeping the old ones there for backwards compatibility. The third level is for templates. These are your individual resources, and where possible should be one template per resource. For example, in a module for HR, we could have one template for employees, one for departments, one for jobs, and so forth. The fourth level is the REST service, the HTTP method, such as get, post, put, and delete. For example, you could add a post handler to create an employee, or a get handler to return a list of employees. The final level is for defining any parameters that your handlers require. For example, if your get handler was returning a list of employees, you might want a parameter of a department number to restrict the employees that are returned. The URL of an Oracle Web Service is made up of 5 elements: the URL for the server, the ORDS alias, which is defaulted to ORDS, the alias for your database schema, the base path for the module, and the template pattern. The URL itself does not contain any reference to the handler, i.e. the HTTP method. This is passed in separately when the web service is called, and if nothing is passed in, it defaults to get. The URL can also include parameters if they're passed in using the URL rather than the header. Okay, let's take a brief look at the database API packages and how to create some web services. There are 2 packages available: the ORDS package, which is for developing RESTful services, and the OAuth package for implementing OAuth authentication. This slide shows some examples of how to use the ORDS API to create some web services. The first statement is enabling the schema. In this example, our schema is called Test API, but we're going to give it the alias of ORDS demo. Next, we're going to define a module. So here we're creating a module for HR and we're giving it a version number. You can see here we're also specifying the items per page. By default, if you call a get web service that returns lots of data, they're paginated into 25 records at a time. You can override this if you wish, like we have here. So here we're saying we only want to have 5 records at a time. If I didn't want any pagination at all, I can set this parameter to 0, and that will return all rows in one go. Next, we're going to define the template. So here we're going to create a departments template for our HR module. The fourth statement is for defining a handler. So here we're going to create a get handler for the department's template within the HR module. We want it to return the result of the query select department number, name and location from the dep table, and we want the data returned in JSON format, so for that source type should be set to source type query. You can also see we've specified the items per page here. This will override whatever has been set at the module level. So in this example we're saying we'd like the results from our department query to come back in batches of 10 rather than what we set at the module level of 5. In the final statement we're defining a parameter. Here we're going to create a parameter for the post handler on the department's template. We've given the parameter the name department_name, and that is how it's referenced when you call the web service. If you wish, the internal name, the bind variable name, can be something different or can be the same. In this example we've called it PV dep name, so that's how the variable will be referenced within the handler. We also need to specify how the parameter is passed in. So in here we've specified it's going to be passed in via the header. We've told it that it's a string and it's an in parameter. You can also see that I've added comments when creating the modules, templates, handlers and parameters. This is a good thing to do because the comments are stored in the orgs metadata schema and can be useful when maintaining your web services in the future. Once created, the web services are stored in the orgs metadata schema. You can view them using the views provided, such as user orgs modules and user orgs templates. This example query returns all of the web services created for a schema. If you've added comments when creating web services, these are also available in the views. I'm now going to give you a quick demo of using the orgs API and the orgs metadata views. Okay, so now I'm going to use the orgs API to create some web services. I've got two scripts. The first one is going to create the web services using the orgs define module, define template and so forth. The second is a query which runs over the top of the orgs metadata views and will list out all the web services that I've created. If I run this now, it's not going to return any data because I haven't created any yet. So let's go back to my create script and I'll run that. That's it done, it should have created them. So let's go back to my view query and run it again. So now you can see I have a list of a few web services that have been created to generate an HR module. So some are returning department information and some are returning employee information. Now I've created the web services, let's test them. To do that I'm going to use a tool called Postman. There are many different tools out there you can use for testing web services. Postman's one I'm currently using. I think it's got a quite straightforward interface and it's quite easy to use. To get going, all you need to do is create a new request. You choose your method, such as get, post, or delete, enter the URL. You can put any parameters you need in here and click send. Once you've created requests, you can save them for running again in the future, and you can also group them into collections. I have a collection over here on the left hand side over the web services I've just created, so let's test a couple. For example, if I click on this one, it's going to bring back my get request for returning my list of all departments. So you can see here it's calling the schema alias, which was orgs demo, my HR version 1 module and my department's template. We set the request equal to get, and if I click on send, it should send that request, and there you go, it's returned the data in JSON format. You can see here the status, for example, as well. That tells me it was 200, which was okay, so it's returned data with no errors. And you can also see it's returned me 5 records and then given me some links at the bottom. The first one takes you to the first page and the second one is taking me to my next link. If I click on this one here, in Postman opens up a new tab and all it does is put the extra parameter of page 1 on the end. If I click on send, it'll run that again and it gives me my next 3 departments. And because I only have 8 altogether, there's no next link, but now we do have a previous link which will take me back to page 0. We can also have a look at the employees. So if I click on the employee list, again you can see it's pretty much the same apart from employees. Again the request is get. I'll click on send. There we go, it's returned some data. I can see the status is 200, telling me everything was successful. And if I scroll down I can see some information for all my employees, and again I've got some next and previous links. There were a couple of other ones. I created some non-paginated versions of them as well, So for example, if I click on this departments one, it's pretty much the same apart from I've got /mp on the end. Click on send. It returns me the same information, but this time I get all of the departments and there are no next and previous links. After creating web services, it's a good idea to protect them, and you can do this with the database API packages ORDS and OAuth. This is achieved using privileges, roles and clients. The privileges protect the web service modules or the patterns. Roles are granted to the clients and linked to one or more privileges, and the clients are assigned to one or more roles and are allocated an ID and a secret. The following example shows how you can protect one of the department web services. The first line creates a department role, the second defines a privilege and assigns it to that role, and the third maps the pattern to the privilege. At this point, the web service matching this pattern is now protected and can no longer be accessed without using authentication. So, the fourth line creates a new client using the client credentials method, and then the final line grants the department role to that client, meaning once authenticated, client A will be able to access the protected departmental web service. Okay, let's protect one of the web services we created earlier and see how we can use Postman to test. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is run this script which is going to protect one of the web services we created earlier. First thing it's going to do is create a role called employee resource role, and then it's going to define a privilege and map it onto that role. And we're going to pass in the pattern HRV1 employees. So as soon as I run this, the web service that returned all the employees will be protected. Okay, that's done. So now if we go over to Postman, we should be able to run the query again and find we no longer have access. Okay, so over in Postman, this is the query we ran last time and it returned us our data. So let's send this request again. And this time it hasn't returned anything. What we can see is a status of 401 unauthorized. And if I just change the mode to preview mode, you can see here that it's returning 401 unauthorized because this web service is now protected, so we do not have access to it. If I go to the departments one, we didn't protect this one, so if I run this again, it still works and we still get the data coming back. So now it's protected, we want to gain access to it. So to do that, we need to create a client. Okay, I have a script here already to create a client. So what this is going to do is use OAuth to create a client called HR Client 1, and then we're going to grant to that client the employee resource role. So if I run that, that's created a client for us, and we can use the ORDS metadata views to have a look. So I have a query here on user ORDS clients, and it's going to return the ID, name, description, and crucially the client ID and client secret. So if I click on run, there we have it. So here's the client I created, and here's the client ID and the secret. Okay, so back over in Postman now, this is our GET request to that web service. If I click on send, still not going to get anything because I need to basically use that client ID and secret to generate an access token. So to do that, I'm going to click on the authorization tab and choose OAuth2 because that's the method we're using, and I'm going to click on get new access token. Here we need to specify a name, the grant type, the URL for our token, which is the same as the web request, but instead of the template and handler, you've got OAuth token. Then I need to specify the ID and secret. I've already pre-pasted those in, and then I have to click on request token. That's now generated a token for us, and it's given us a life of 3,600 seconds, so it's going to be around for basically an hour. If I click on use token, it will add that straight away into this request. So now if I click on send, now we're authenticated. I'll just change this back to format it nicely in JSON format, so you can see it's passed the access token when it's called the web service. That has linked it to the client, which has access to the role, which has access to this pattern. So we're now being authenticated. Now we understand how Oracle Web Services are structured, created and stored in the database, we can look at the new ORDS RESTful Service interface that was introduced in Apex version 18.1. As I mentioned earlier, web services created in Apex are now stored in the ords metadata schema. Therefore, the web service I just created using the database API packages should be available to view and maintain within Apex. Any new web services I create in Apex will now be able to be viewed using the ords metadata views and maintained using the APIs. When you access RESTful services in Apex, there are two possible options: Apex-based and ords-based. The Apex-based option is for viewing and migrating web services created in earlier versions up to 5.1. The ords-based is the new option from 18.1, and that we're going to have a look at today. If the schema has not been registered for ords, this needs to be done first, and you can do this by clicking on the registration button. This opens a modal page where you can give your schema an alias. You can also choose to install the sample services on the empt and dep table if you wish. Once a schema has been enabled, you will see the ords RESTful Services dashboard. This gives you a summary of the web services that have been created for the schema. It gives you information on the number of modules, privileges and roles and so forth. It also gives you information on the publish status and the security status. You can navigate using the tree on the left hand side or by directly clicking on any area of the dashboard to drill down. As Apex is using the ords metadata schema, you will have full access to any of the web services created using the database APIs. Creating web services in Apex follow exactly the same steps as using the database APIs. You need to create your modules, templates, handlers and define any parameters, and then if you want to protect, you need to create your roles and your privileges. Okay, let's take a look at the Apex RESTful Services interface and how to create some web services. Okay, so I've opened up Apex and I've connected to the same workspace as we created our web services in. So let's have a look. We click on SQL Workshop and I'm going to click on RESTful Services. Because this schema has already been enabled for ords, it's just taken us straight in. You can see here the ords version at the top, and I can see here the schema up here as well, and then here's the dashboard in the middle, which gives us information like the number of modules, privileges and roles. We've got a tree over here on the left hand side, and you can see here's our HR version 1 module, and I've got the templates here, and I've got the handlers under here. To navigate around, you can use the tree just by clicking around, or alternatively you can navigate around using the dashboard. So for example, if I want to go into the employees template, I can just click on it from here, and if I want to go into the get handler, I can click on it here and just keep drilling down. Looking back at the module level, we can see here we've got our module name, there's the base path, we've got the pagination side, which was our override, we've got our comments here as well, and then if we look down at the templates, you can see here the 4 templates that we created for the module, and you can see the employees one is the only one that's protected. If we navigate into one, you can see here again we've got the comments, and then we've got the methods underneath. So if we have a look at the get method, you can see here the source type is query, format is JSON. Again, we've got the comments here that we created, and then here's our query, which is running our statement. Another useful feature, if I click on the module, is you'll notice there's a generate Swagger document button. So if you like to use Swagger for documenting your web services, this will export the definition, which you can then import into Swagger. Simply click on the button and you see the definition exported in JSON format. All I need to do is just copy this and then go to Swagger. Over in Swagger Hub, all I need to do is create a new API, give it a name, it should create a sample for us, which it does. I'll just delete this code in here, and if I just paste in what I copied, it will ask me if I want to convert the JSON to YAML, which is the format. I click on yes, and give it a couple of seconds. There you go. So that's created the definition for us, and you can see we've got our different templates over here for our web services. So I've got example the get there on departments. If I have a look at say the post on departments, you can see the parameters. So it's a good starting point. Okay, now let's create a new web service and add it to our HR module. Haven't got anything at the moment on location, so let's create one for that. I've clicked on the module, so I'm going to click on Create Template. First thing we need to do is give the template a name. We'll call it Locations. And then we can give it a comment if we want. And then click on Create Template. Now we've created a template, we need to create some handlers. So I'll click on the Create Handler button. And for this one, we're going to use a get. Source type defaults to collection query. This is the newer style. So this is very similar to the query of the other types, but it returns the data in the new standard for Oracle and has a little bit of extra information on the end, which I'll show you in a moment when we test it. Format is JSON. Pagination size, let's set that to 0. This will force it to return all the rows in one go, and again we can give it a comment. All we need to do now is put in our query source. I've got one I prepared earlier, so this is just going to select the country code, title and location code from the location table, and it's got an order by on it. So if I just copy that, and then I'll paste that in, and then I'm going to click on Create Handler. That has now created our web service, and you can see here this is the URL that we access it by, so I can just copy that, and now we can test it with Postman. Over in Postman, let's just create a new request. The type is already set to get, so all I need to do is paste in my URL and click send. That sends off the request. You can see here the status is 200 OK, and here is my list in JSON format of locations, and you can see there's no pagination, all the rows have been returned. And this was the extra information I was telling you about. Gives you things like a count of how many rows there are, whether there's any more, and things like that. So slightly different format, but it's the new standard. Okay, now we've created a web service using the Apex front end. Let's have a look at how you protect them. So over here you'll see we've got privileges and roles. If I expand roles, you can see there's the employee resource role I created earlier. The only property you have is the name. And if I expand privileges, you can see the employee privilege that I also created earlier. And if we have a look at this one, you can see it's got a title. You can see that it's linked to one role. And then you can see it's not protecting any modules, but it is protecting one single pattern. So what we can do now is let's protect that locations web service that we just created. So to do that, first of all, I'm going to create a new role. So I'm going to call this location resource role. And I'll just click on create. And then now I'm going to create a privilege. So I'll create privilege and I'll call it location.priv. Give it a title. Next I need to choose which role or roles it links to, and I'm just going to choose this location resource role. Then I need to tell it what it's protecting. So I could either protect a whole module or just an individual pattern. In this instance it is just a pattern that I want to protect, so I'll click on add role and I'm going to type in /HR/v1/locations. As soon as I go up to the top and click on create privilege, that has now protected that web service. So if I go straight back to Postman and I click on send again, this time it should not work. There we are, status code up here is 401 unauthorized. If I put it in preview mode, I'm getting the same. So that web service is now being protected. To gain access, I would now need a client with access. So how about I use that client I used before? So I could click on authorization, click on OAuth 2, I can select my token I created before and click on send, but that won't work either. That's because that access token is linked to a client that has access to the employee's web service. In order to gain access to this locations one, we either need to grant access to that client or we can create a new client. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just grant that role we created to that same client. So if I just run that, now HR Client 1 will also have access to the locations web service. If we go back to Postman, if I click on send again, it still won't work because when we generated that access token, the client didn't have access to the locations web service, so we need to create a new access token. So I click on get new, call it token B, click on request token. The ID and the secret haven't changed, so we get our new token. I click on use, click on send, and now it will work. And I'll just click there to format it in JSON format, and you can see status was 200 OK, and we've got the data. So that's great. So we've now protected our web service, and it's all working. In addition to creating web services for our own applications, we can consume web services within our applications. From Apex version 18.1 onwards, this has been made even easier to do. There are 4 options available within Apex. Legacy web service references. This is the option that we had in Apex 5 and has now been largely superseded. The main drawback of this is that you needed to handle the responses manually before you could use the data. Next we have web source modules. This is one of the newest options that was first introduced in version 18.1. Web source modules can be used directly in components such as interactive reports, charts and calendars, etc. and the data can be parsed automatically, so this is very useful. The Apex Web Services PL/SQL API is still available for manually calling and handling responses. And lastly, we have the REST Enable SQL option, which can be used to execute SQL and PL/SQL on remote databases. This was also new in version 18.1. So today I'm going to demonstrate how to use the 2 newest features, Web Source Modules and REST Enable SQL. Right, I have a Apex application that I created earlier on. There's nothing in it apart from a home page and one list of values shared component that I created earlier, which I'll be using a little bit later on. So I'm going to click on shared components, and the first thing I'd like to have a look at is web source modules. So I'm going to click on this option here. We don't have any at the moment, so let's create one. And for this example, I'm just going to use the web services I created earlier, and I'll use the one that returns a list of all the employees with no pagination. So I'm going to click on create, choose next. So for the source, we've got 3 different versions here. Click on the little question mark, gives you a little bit of information about each. The one we're going to be using is simple HTTP. So this one is assuming that it's a simple data feed with all the data being returned with no pagination and no free filtering on it. So the one we created earlier on for all employees will be perfect for this. So I need to give it a name, so for now I'll just call it employees. And I need to give it the endpoint URL. So this is just the full URL of the web service. So if I just paste that in, you'll see it's calling my Ords Demo Schema, HR version 1 module, and the employees template. Click on next. What this does is it now splits it out into the base URL and the service URL path. So the base URL is basically takes us all the way up to the schema, and then the rest of it, the module and the template, becomes the service URL path. So I'll click on next. For this example, we're not going to use authentication, just to keep it simple, so I'll just click on discover. So that's worked, it's been successful, and it's found some information. It gives me 2 tabs on this page. It shows me some of the sample data that's coming back, so I can tell this is the right one because we're getting jobs, employee names and numbers and so forth. And if I click on the data profile, it gives me some information about the types of data that are coming back. So for example, you can see dname is a varchar 2. So I'm just going to click on create web source. So that's done. That's now created our web source for us, and we can now use that within our application. But let's just have a little look inside first. So if I just click on it to dig into the detail, you can see at the top of the page we have the information that we entered, telling it the source type, which was the simple HTTP. You can see the remote server there that we were using and the path. And then a little bit further down we have the data profile, which is set to JSON, and we can go and have a look at that in a moment. And you can also see that it's created one operation. It's created a get to return all the rows. We can test this if we wish, just by clicking on this little button. That does a test, so you can see the data that's coming back. You can see this is the parsed data, so everything that's coming back. If you click on the headers, this is the header information that's coming back. For example, you can see the contact type is JSON, and then you can click on the body, so this is the actual full body that's coming back. So that's good, I'm happy with that. Let's go and have a look at the data profile. So if I edit the data profile, so this gives us a little bit of information about what's actually coming back. So you can see on the definition column here, you can see these are the actual columns of data that are coming back for each row, and this is how they are referenced by the web service. Over here you can see this is the name that we're going to be using within Apex. This is an interactive grid, and we can edit some of the information if we wish. So for example, let's say I didn't want it to be called job within my Apex application. I can change this to be something else. So job title, for example. And just click on save. So the actual reference coming back from the web service is still job, but internally within the Apex application I can refer to it as I please, and I'm going to use job title. Okay, so I'll just click on apply changes, go back up to the top level. So now let's use that web source module to create an interactive report. So I'm going to click on create page. I'll choose report and interactive report, and then I'm going to give it a name, employees. Click next. Might as well put it on the menu. Now you'll notice we have three options for the data source. The usual one of local database, but we also have REST enabled SQL service. This is something I'm going to have a look at in a moment, and web source. So let's choose that one. Then we get a list of web source modules to select from. We only have the one that we've created, so let's select that. And you can see as soon as I've done that, it automatically shuttles across all the columns that are available. If I don't want one of them, I can just shuttle them back, just like any normal interactive report on a local database. I'll keep them all, so let's click create. So that will create us an interactive report. Okay, so let's just run that one straight away. So as you can see, I now have a page with an interactive report of my employees. The only difference being I'm not running it on a local database table or a view, I'm running it on a web service. But apart from that, it's exactly the same. So I can sort by any of the columns, I can filter by anything that I like, so for example the title, and if I go and edit that page, I can make any changes that I would normally make. So for example, if I go to the columns and I want to rename the heading for the department, I can do that. So let's just change this to department. And I could change anything else, such as the alignment. And if I just click and run that now, you can see it's behaving just like a normal interactive report. Let's just go back and have a look behind the scenes. If I click on the employees region, you can see over here on the properties, the source is set to web source, and there's our module employees. And if you look down here, we have another option called local post-processing. Now what this allows us to do is manipulate the data that comes back from the web service before it renders in our interactive report. So if I click on this option here, there are three options. If you click on the help, it'll give you a little bit more information. So you can manipulate the where and order by clauses, you can manipulate the SQL query itself and transform the data that way, or you can also use a PL SQL function to do it that way. So for this example, I'm just going to do a SQL query. So if I choose SQL query and edit it, what you'll see is this is the query that's being run. So it's doing a select of the columns from Apex source data. So we can manipulate this just like any SQL query. And I've got an example here already. So what I'm going to do is select the country code, but then select an account and add a group by, so we can see a total of employees by country code. So I'll just copy that, go back to our interactive report and just paste that in, validate it, click OK, and now I'll run. And there we go. So now our report's refreshed. You can see we've got two columns, the country code and the number of employees. So we've taken that data that came from the web service and we're actually manipulating it to give us a summary. I can go one step further than that. So if I go back and edit the page, go back to our query, this time what I want to do is actually join this data source onto a local table that I have. So if I go back to an example query I've already got, so this one, same as the last statement, but we're going to join onto it the country table, which is a local table. We've got our join condition here, and then we're going to do a group by the two columns. So it's basically going to give us the same information, but we're going to add on a country title. So I'll just replace that, validate it, click OK, and let's rerun our report. This time we get the same information we did before, but we're also picking up the country title coming from a local table on our local database. Okay, so now we've created an interactive report over a web source module. Let's have a look at something else you can do. Let's have a look at a chart. So I'll go back into our application and I shall create a new page. And I'm going to use chart as an option. I'll stick with the bar chart, give it a name, employee chart, give it a breadcrumb, and I'll put it on the menu. Okay, so we've got our local database as the default, but let's choose web source again. I'll choose our employees module, and I'll just click on next. I'll create a horizontal chart. I'll put country code on the label, and for now I'll just put employee for the value. So that's created a chart. I just need to make a slight change to that. If I go down to the series, what I want it to do is I'll take that value out of there and tell it that I want to do a count instead. And I'll just run that. And there we go. So now that's a chart based on a web service. So you can see it's the same information we were using for the interactive report, but this time we've got country codes and a chart giving us how many employees we've got working for each of the areas. And if we go back and have a look at that page, up at the top here you can see that the region is using the web source employees to generate the data. And we've also got the local post-processing option here, so again, if we wanted to manipulate the data, we could do. Okay, so one more thing I'd like to show you is how we can use parameters with the web services. If I go back into our shared components and go back into the web source modules, you can see here we have our employees entry. Now, if you remember, there was an option for this web service for passing in a department number to limit the employees. So what we can actually do is go and add that in if we wish. So I'm going to click on the get operation and I'm going to click on the add parameter option. We have to specify how it's passed in, which is the header, and I need to give it the name. So the name was department underscore number. And I can give it a default of 0. We have to tell it whether it's an in or an out, and if it's static or not. I'm happy with those values, so I'm just going to click that. Click on the add, don't need anything else. And now I've added the parameter, I can go and use it. So I'll just click apply. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new page, and I'll create an interactive report, and I'll call it employees plus department. Give it a breadcrumb. I'll stick it on the menu. And what I'm going to do now is again choose web source. I'm going to choose employees, take them all. And this time you'll notice it's telling us we have a web source parameter. So it's called department underscore number and has a default of 0. So I'll just click on create. So what that's now done is it's creating us an interactive report, just as it did before, but this time what we have is a parameter of department number. So what I'm going to do is just do a little bit of updates to this page so that we can select a department and filter the employees. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a select list to this page and call it dept. I'm going to tell it the source. So the source for this is a shared component and a list of departments. I created them earlier on. I won't display extra values, and for the null I'm going to use that as my all option and just tell it that return 0, and I'm also just going to give it a default of 0 as well. Okay. I also want to make sure the report is refreshed automatically every time I change the department, so I'm just going to right click and create a dynamic action and call this refresh, and tell it that every time I change the department I want it to run the action refresh. So I'll just go and choose that, tell it it's the region, and choose my report region. I also need to click on my region and tell it that every time it refreshes the report just to submit the value for that page item. So I'll do that, and then the last thing I need to do is go back to the parameters for the web service and just link that department number to the item on my page. So instead of a static value, I choose item, pick that item there, and click save. And so now if I run the page, we've got our interactive report, but we've also got a department up the top. So by default we're seeing all of the 27 employees. If I click on the department list and choose one of the departments, what it's doing is every time I change the department it refreshes the report. That calls the web service, passes in the value of our parameter, and then we only get the employees returned from the web service to our interactive report for that department. There we go. And if I choose all, it just passes the 0 through, which tells the web service just to return all of the employees. Okay, now we've taken a look at web source modules, let's take a look at REST enabled SQL. Before you do this, it's worthwhile checking that ORDS has been set up to use REST enabled SQL. To do this, simply take a look at your configuration file and check that the REST enabled SQL.active entry is in your configuration. Okay, first thing we need to do is go back into our application and go to Shared Components and choose the option REST Enable SQL. For this demonstration I have another schema which we're going to remote onto called PRD test. This has been enabled for ORDS but has no web services and has a few sample tables from one of the sample Apex applications. So first thing we need to do is click on Create, and we have to give it a name, so I'll just kind of call it product, and we have to give it the endpoint URL. So the endpoint URL goes down to the schema level. Click on Next. Next I have to enter some credentials, so give the credentials a name, and then we can either use OAuth 2 or basic authentication. For this example I'm just going to use basic authentication, and I'm going to put in my schema name and my schema password, and then re-enter it. If I was doing OAuth authentication, it would be the client ID and secret I'd be using instead. Click Create, and that's been successful. If you'd like to have a look at what that's created, we can go to Workspace Utilities, and if you have a look at the REST Enable SQL Services option, you can see our entry here, and you can go into it and have a look if you need to make any changes, and you can also test it from here as well should any changes be made. And also if you have a look at the web credentials, this is where our credentials have been created, so you can see the entry I've made, and again if the passwords change or if I want to change to using OAuth 2, I can just make my changes in here. Okay. Right, so I'm going to go back into the application now, and I'm going to create a page. I'll create a report, and I'll choose Interactive Report, and I'll just give it a name. And then for the data source I'm going to select REST Enabled SQL Service. I'll then choose the service we've just created, and I've got an option of a table or a SQL query. if I choose the table option, I can then select any of the tables in that schema. For example, I'll choose the population table. And then, just the same as if I was creating a report on the local database, it gives me all the columns, and I can choose the ones I want, or just have all of them, and click Create. And there we have a page with our interactive report. So if we have a look at the interactive report, you'll see it says here that it's a remote database, tells us the remote database we're using, and tells us which table we're selecting from. So if I run that now, there you go. It's a normal interactive report, but this time it's using REST to run the SQL statement on a remote database and return us the results. We can also create a report on a query. So if I just go back into the application, let's create a new page. I'll choose Report, Interactive Report, give it a name, and then choose REST Enable SQL Service, choose our service product, and this time I'll choose SQL Query. And I'm just going to paste in a query that I prepared earlier, and you can see what it's doing is this selects from a couple of tables from our remote schema. I'll just click on Create, and there we go. Let's just run that and test it works, which it does. Go back into the page, have a look at the report, and again you can see the source of this region is a remote database call, but this time we're using a SQL query. And if I need to make any change to this, I can do. And like any other interactive report, I can make changes to the heading alignments, put format masks on, and things like that. Okay. You can also use REST Enabled SQL for charts, so let's create one of those. So I'll choose chart, a bar chart will be fine, give it a name, and then for my location, instead of local database, I'll use REST Enabled SQL Service, choose my product service, I'll stick with the SQL query, and here's one I prepared earlier. So this is doing a query from the remote schema onto the products and orders table, just give me some information for a chart. Click on Next. I'll stick with horizontal, I will choose product name for my label and the quantity for my value. Click on Create. That's now created me a chart. If we have a look at the series, we can see there's the query. It's on the remote database using the product service, and we can see we've got label, product name, and the value for the quantity. Let's run that, and there we go. We have our bar chart run on a remote database using the REST Enabled SQL Service. There we go. Okay, that brings me to the end of the demonstration. I hope you found some of it useful. If you'd like further information, you can take a look at our website, www.explorer.uk.com. We've got hundreds of blogs on there and lots of useful information. And you can also contact me directly. My email address is colin.archer@explorer.uk.com. Thank you very much.